It's my great pleasure to get a chance to um, introduce our speaker for today's seminar. Michael is, I'm just getting to know him. He's a terrific person, and I hope all of you get a chance to not just hear what he has to say today, but actually, in addition to asking a few questions, figure out how you can have some time to learn from him, because I'm finding I'm learning a lot. Michael is an associate professor of sociology at Drake University. Now you might be saying, I thought this was a talk on the coast, and gee, I think Drake might be in Iowa, and you'd be right, which also adds to something that's interesting about his talk. He earned his PhD in sociology at University of California, San Diego, and the title of his talk today is The Politics of a Sustainable Coast, Money, Science, Democracy, and Climate in Southeastern Louisiana. So it brings so much to the interesting kinds of questions that we're thinking about. And just to give you a sense of how the intersection of the topics that he's discussing, this seminar today is co-sponsored by the Mitchell Center, the Margaret Chase Smith Center, sociology, and there are people from honors here, all really interested in the work that Michael's doing. I'm interested because, well, it sounds so fascinating in terms of sociology. I'm also interested because I think Iowa is just one of the best places. I grew up there. And I'm also interested, although he has so much to say, he won't get a chance to talk about his food work. I'm also interested because he's doing interesting food work. And if you haven't had a chance to look him up, he has a book that's called Organizing Organic Conflict and Compromise in an Emerging Market from the Stanford University Press. That's very good. So let's all give him a hand, and thank you for coming and talking to us.
There we go. Okay, thank you, Linda, so much. So we're going to go from the coast here of Maine to another coast, the southern coast of Louisiana, in this talk. And I do live and work in Iowa, but Iowa does have a connection with Louisiana, which of course is the Mississippi River. And I'll spend some time talking about the Mississippi today in this talk. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share this research with you. And I'd like to thank David Hart and Linda Silka and Amy Blackstone for helping to organize this talk. And of course, I'd like to thank as well the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center and the Department of Sociology as well, which are helping to sponsor the presentation that I'm giving here. So the title of the talk is, as Linda mentioned, The Politics of a Sustainable Coast, Money, Science, Democracy, and Climate in Southeastern Louisiana. It's based on research that I began in 2015, and the research is still ongoing. The research focuses on the development and the implementation of what's known as Louisiana's master plan for a sustainable coast. And I approach this topic as an environmental sociologist. So I'm especially interested in the social organization of this master plan. One of my goals is to understand the history of this master plan, and more broadly, the history of coastal sustainability in southern Louisiana. And the other goal is to understand the politics of this master plan. So essentially, how do things get done, and who is included, who is excluded, in coalitions built around sustainability in this state. I'm going to tell you in a bit more detail about the master plan in just a few minutes, but I'd like to begin just by giving you an overview of how I want to spend, say, 40 minutes of our time here today. So I'd like to begin by talking about the environmental problem of land loss in coastal Louisiana, which is the context of this research, and also about the goal of coastal restoration in Louisiana, sort of as a way of setting a background for the analysis that I'd like to do of the master plan. Next, I'll describe some of the guiding questions and sociological perspectives that inform the study, and then I'll speak through some aspects of the master plan's development and of its current organization, focusing on politics, science, and public engagement. And then finally, I'd like to make a connection between Louisiana's master plan and the broader issue of climate change adaptation. And I want to focus in particular on what Louisiana's experience reveals about how and why patterns of adaptation can become closed and sort of exclusive, and also how and why they might be made more open and democratic. The research that I've done for the project is qualitative in nature. So I've used a mix of different methods so far in the research. I've done interviews with stakeholders of Louisiana's master plan, about 39 interviews, I think, at last count, although it's been a little while since I've gone back and looked at the number I've done. Archival research about the science of coastal sustainability in Louisiana and about the development of laws and political institutions supporting sustainability, and also observations of public meetings related to these efforts that I'm going to tell you about. And as in much qualitative scholarship, sort of the analysis that I'm doing involves looking for themes that cut across these different sources of data, and then putting those themes in dialogue, right, with other work in environmental sociology and sustainability science and adaptation studies and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into too much detail about those methods just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to speak more about them after the talk if anybody would like to ask any questions about that. So I want to begin by saying a little bit about what the master plan is and about what it's trying to accomplish. Louisiana's master plan is a document that's gone through 3 iterations so far. So the first one was in 2007, the next was in 2012, and the most recent 2017. Each version was produced by a state agency called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or CPRA. The CPRA submits a draft of the master plan to the Louisiana legislature, which then votes to approve the master plan for each of these periods. In understanding what these documents are, it's helpful to break the name into 2 parts. So beginning with coastal sustainability, what are the threats to sustainability? Well, the master plan is an effort to deal with the environmental problem of land loss in southern Louisiana. And this problem has pretty dire long-term implications for communities and ecosystems along the coast. So coastal Louisiana, particularly the southeastern coast, is a dynamic geological environment. The coastline from Morgan City, which is here, this little arrow, Morgan City, up to the Mississippi border, here is essentially a delta of the Mississippi River. As the river changed course over centuries, it has built new areas of land, and other areas have subsided into the ocean. So really all of this is a pretty dynamic geological area. For the last century, though, the rate at which land has disappeared along the coast has exceeded the rate at which new land has been built. According to research by the U.S. Geological Survey, coastal Louisiana experienced a net land loss of about 1,883 square miles between 1930 and 2010. One advocacy group, America's Wetland Foundation, has pointed out that this averages out to about a football field's worth of land disappearing every hour. If you put it all together, this would be slightly less land that has disappeared than the surface area of the state of Delaware over about the last century. And what USGS has done here is all of the areas that are in red and yellow and purple are all areas of land disappearance, net land loss, right? The color just indicates the decade in which this took place. And then the little area of green here and then down here in the Bird's Foot Delta at the mouth of the Mississippi River is new land that has been created. So as you can see, much more land lost than new land that's been created. So why is this happening? Why is Louisiana's coastline disappearing? Well, some of the reasons have nothing at all to do with human activities. The soil in Louisiana has a lot of organic matter, southern Louisiana, and so as this matter decomposes, the land subsides, it sinks. Geological activity as well along fault lines contributes to the sinking of certain areas of land. So even if nobody lived in southern Louisiana and there was nothing going on there, human created, we'd still see a lot more morphological change, a lot more change in the shape of the coastline than we would see in non-deltaic regions, so like the coast of Maine, for example. But much of this recent net land loss can be connected to human activities. On the one hand, construction of levees along the Mississippi River, flood control levees, which began in earnest in the 19th century and was completed in the 20th century, has meant that riverborne sediments are channeled out into the Gulf of Mexico rather than being deposited in wetlands along the coast. This is a aerial photo from the most recent version of the master plan that shows this process. So here you can see sediment flowing out into the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico, also a little bit here into Lake Pontchartrain, and all of these wetlands, which at one point were replenished by annual river floods, now going without sediment, contributing to subsidence in those areas. On the other hand, the dredging of canals for navigation and for oil and gas exploration has changed drainage patterns and changed water salinity, both of which damage wetlands. This is a photograph of an area in southern Louisiana called Golden Meadow, where there's been a lot of onshore oil and gas extraction. You can see that there are the outlines of these canals here, the geometric patterns, and along these canals are what's known as spoil banks, which is when a canal is excavated, what's taken out is piled up on the banks, right? The spoil banks are what gets in the way of drainage patterns, and the land between the spoil banks eventually gradually sinks, gets submerged as a result of that. Also, these canals allow salt water to flow in from the Gulf of Mexico, and that as well contributes to erosion, to the loss of vegetation and then erosion. Now, another set of factors that contributes to land loss has to do with global climate change. As oceans warm, sea levels rise, and since much of coastal Louisiana is at or near, or if you live in New Orleans, even below sea level, this rise has a pretty significant impact on the shoreline. Climate change also has the potential to increase the severity and the frequency of storms in the Gulf of Mexico. And when these storms or hurricanes make landfall in Louisiana, they can flood coastal wetlands. This, in turn, harms plant species and increases erosion. So, for example, again, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005 combined destroyed about 217 square miles of wetlands area along coastal Louisiana. Now, the 2017 version of the master plan included 50-year projections of land loss in southern Louisiana under different environmental scenarios. And these scenarios were modeled using several climate-related factors, such as sea level rise and precipitation, storm frequency, storm intensity. And as you can see, projected losses under the medium environmental scenario and the high environmental scenario, and this is assuming that nothing is really done to try to stem this land loss, are really quite severe. In particular, even in the high environmental scenario in particular, New Orleans, which is right here, basically becomes an island, sort of sticking out into the Gulf of Mexico, and that's assuming that none of the flood protection systems around New Orleans fail, which is maybe not a safe assumption. Okay, so what about the second part, the master plan? What is the master plan? Well, what this document tries to do is lay out a coast-wide strategy to protect communities and to reduce or even stabilize rates of land loss. Some of the strategy in the master plan has to do with building levees and building flood walls, which you see here in purple, which is kind of a perennial activity in southern Louisiana. But the more interesting and innovative part, I think, has to do with environmental restoration. So this involves projects that repair damaged land or even potentially build new land along the southern coastline. And these include shoreline protection, reinforcing shorelines. They include restoring barrier islands, creating marshes. The centerpiece really is the construction of a set of sediment diversions along the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya River. And you can see that these areas here, all of the areas that are shaded in brown, are projected to be helped by these sediment diversions. So it's a large-scale strategy. And I'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. Now, Louisiana has supported environmental restoration projects since at least the beginning of the 1990s, mainly under what's known as the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act, or CWIPRA. It's also known as the Breaux Act, after former Senator John Breaux of Louisiana, who was the main author of this law. But these projects were pretty small scale, and they were undertaken in a piecemeal fashion. The master plan aims to change that in two ways. First, it approaches the coast as an entire unit and tries to coordinate restoration projects across the region. And second, it uses a variety of hydrological and ecological and engineering models in an effort to select from among proposed projects those that are most likely to have a significant impact on the coast. It is important, though, to recognize that the projects really don't have the potential to restore all of the land that has been lost, or even to keep the coast of Louisiana in its current state. So this is a projection, 50-year projection under the medium environmental scenario, assuming that all of the projects in the master plan are built. Green areas are land that is either newly created or land that would have been lost, that would be preserved. Red areas are areas of land loss. So there will be a substantial amount of land that disappears, even if the master plan is put into effect. The goal really is to identify areas where land restoration is possible and to use the projects to protect some of the economic and ecological activities and human communities along the coast. And also, of course, since there's uncertainty about what exactly climate change will look like in the future, in southern Louisiana and elsewhere, what the severity and the extent of impacts will be, there's some uncertainty about how this is all going to play out. It's also important, I think, to realize that for people in southern Louisiana, this is really an existential issue. So you can debate what the state can do, what the state should do, but you can't really assume that you can do nothing and have life go on as it has gone on for the last century or before. And it's really not possible simply to write the region off and say, let's just let the chips fall where they may, because to do so would invite some pretty significant human catastrophes and ecological catastrophes. So something along the scale of Hurricane Katrina on a regular basis. And in this sense, I think people in southern Louisiana are among the first to experience the sorts of challenges that are likely to affect many more people in many other coastal regions in years to come. I'd like to show you a few photographs of what land loss looks like on the ground. These are from a trip that I took down to southern Louisiana in 2015. Land loss is one of the slow processes that's hard to sort of represent photographically. So the photos might not look all that dramatic, but if you think about the implications of the things that they show, I think they are dramatic. So this is one picture that I took along the southern coast. It's a sort of a creek running by a house. One of the ways in which land loss appears is when you see things that formerly were above the surface of the water that have gradually become submerged. So in this case, it's this sign here that certainly at one point was a sign sticking out where you could read the writing, but over time has become submerged as the land has sunk and the water has risen. This house here is not one that is elevated as many houses are in southern Louisiana. So with just another foot or a couple feet of water level rise or land subsidence, the water will be up around the bottom of this house. This is a picture of a situation where this actually has happened. Many people in Louisiana have camps, vacation homes along the southern coast, and often they are up on pilings, as this one is. But this is a situation where at one point this house was not sitting in the water. There was a driveway that went up to it, and now it is in the water. And this is not an unusual situation for people who have property along the southern coast. Infrastructure is also in danger. So here you can see that the water is only a foot or two below the edge of the roadway here. In a storm, water would easily come up, go over the roadway, and again, with more rise in sea level, more sinking of the land, thus the road itself would be in danger. And that, of course, would affect the fortunes of people who rely on the road, right, for supplies and for travel. So I'd like to talk now for a little bit about what it means to look at the master plan historically and politically. And I'm going to come at this question in a bit of a roundabout way by telling you about two moments that help me think about how to use the insights of sociology to examine coastal sustainability in Louisiana in particular, but also to think about broader puzzles about coastal land management and climate adaptation in other regions. So first, in August, I had the opportunity to speak with David Hart about this project, and he reminded me of Eric Severeid's statement that the chief cause of problems is solutions. That is, solutions that are developed without a full understanding of the context in which they're put into place risk producing unintended negative consequences. Interestingly, a similar point was made in 2009 by Gene Turner, a wetlands ecologist who works at Louisiana State University and who has been critical of the state's approach to developing the master plan. So Turner described the perspective informing the master plan as what he called a knowledge-based worldview, and he contrasted that with a worldview based on ignorance and doubt. The value of an ignorance-based worldview, Turner argued, lies in its assumption that areas of scientific certainty are relatively limited, while the peril of a knowledge-based worldview lies in its confidence that areas of uncertainty are small and insignificant. As Turner put it, when the knowledge-based worldview is combined with a sense of urgency to do something, then the intellectual landscape is flattened, the introduction of new ideas is impeded, monitoring and adaptive management are marginalized, risky behaviors continue, and social learning is restricted. This, in turn, increases the risk that activities meant to provide solutions will generate unforeseen problems of their own. Now, the question of a worldview is as much a sociological one as a scientific one. So professional communities may be organized in ways that encourage particular cognitive frameworks and stifle rival viewpoints, or they may be organized in ways that facilitate negotiation and dialogue between different ideas and forms of knowledge. Karen Noor-Cetino's work, for example, in epistemic cultures, is one of the areas of scholarship that engages with this. She and others who do this work look at the social organization of professional communities that are involved in knowledge production and argue that different professional communities have different cultures that engage with ideas in different ways. So it's possible to ask about the extent to which the professional community working on coastal restoration in Louisiana exhibits this sort of closure, and about the extent to which engagement with multiple perspectives, or about the extent to which it engages with multiple perspectives and forms of knowledge. So that's moment one. And moment two occurred in early September when I received an email from a nonprofit organization in New Orleans called the Center for Ethical Living and Social Justice Renewal. Now, I've had a relationship with this organization for a number of years. It began when they hosted a course that I took to Southern Louisiana for a 3-week travel seminar. These are students in that course. We had just arrived after taking a very early morning flight, so we were all a little loopy at that point. But we stayed in this organization called the Center for Ethical Living and Social Justice Renewal. I receive updates from them on a regular basis. When I received this email, Hurricane Harvey had just flooded Houston and other communities along the Texas Gulf Coast. And the organization offered a statement of support and gratitude for first responders and local heroes, and everyone planning to go and help with the recovery. But the email continued. So much of the work of this organization, it read, has emerged in response to the helping that came after the flood of New Orleans. The helping that did not acknowledge centuries of systemic oppression that preceded the flood. The helping that did not honor the agency of the people being helped. The helping that came without a power analysis, that made helpers feel good and demanded gratitude for work that the helpers would never allow to pass muster in their own homes or communities. Louisiana is a place of great social inequalities, which are deeply institutionalized into the state's politics and communities. And as this email pointed out, because the environmental disaster of Hurricane Katrina played out on this treacherous social landscape, The storm's consequences and the character of the recovery effort that followed can't be understood without an analysis of power and patterns of social marginalization and exclusion. Now, for all of the technical and scientific modeling that informs Louisiana's master plan, power, marginalization, and exclusion are largely undiscussed. In fact, the master plan's supporters often emphasize the, quote, science-driven character of the restoration effort as a way of defending it against the critiques of those who may stand to lose from some of the proposed projects. This was the case with one advocate that I interviewed who asked of the master plan's critics, quote, what science do they have? And noted later, quote, if they had science on their side, we could figure out how to make this better. But to suggest that science is simply a neutral arbiter of political disagreement is naive. The doing of science takes resources, and to suggest of a resource-poor opponent that they do not have science on their side is something like faulting a person who can't afford a museum's admissions fee for not being able to influence the content of the exhibits that it contains. So science is not simply a handmaiden of wealth and power, but it is not so distant as to be immune from their gravitational pull. The recent work of Scott Frickel and others on research agenda setting in scientific communities and on what they call undone science is one of the places where this insight is being developed. So taken together, these moments pose a set of questions that I think fit well with sociological concerns. How has an analysis of power and inequality been defined as external to and largely irrelevant for coastal restoration planning and implementation? How is this flattening of the intellectual landscape, as Turner put it, connected with practices of social exclusion and marginalization? And what implications might these practices have for the viability of strategies proposed in the master plan? And in the rest of my talk, I'd like to explore these questions, thinking historically about the development of coastal restoration work, and also about the organization of coastal restoration activities in Louisiana today. There are three patterns that I want to emphasize. The first is the increasing role that the state's business leaders have played in marshaling political support for coastal restoration. The second is the concentration of scientific modeling and planning into a single organization, which is known as the Water Institute of the Gulf. And the third is the fraught and uncertain nature of public deliberation about coastal restoration priorities. So I want to address those three things one by one. So I'll begin with business leaders' role in the politics of coastal restoration. Well, supporters of Louisiana's master plan like to point out that the problem of land loss was first recognized by a biologist named Percy Vioska, who headed the Louisiana Department of Conservation in the 1920s. So knowledge about land loss has been around for some time. But advocacy for coastal restoration is a more recent phenomenon. So the first organized coastal restoration advocacy group was a group known as the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, or CRCL, which came together in the mid-1980s. And in its early years, CRCL was really not a mover and shaker in Louisiana politics. So as the group's first executive director, a person named Paul Kemp, put it to me in an interview, CRCL was a very eclectic group, but mostly people with no money or influence when it was formed. The group's members included attorneys from national environmental organizations, coastal scientists from Louisiana universities, religious leaders, and residents in fishing communities. Now, CRCL's first major act in 1989 was to publish what they called a citizens program for saving the Mississippi River Delta region to protect its heritage, economy, and environment, also known as Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. This was essentially a review of the scientific evidence that existed at that point about coastal land loss, together with a set of regulatory and administrative policy proposals meant to get the ball rolling for a coastal restoration program of 1989. And then 10 years later, CRCL published a second report, which was titled No Time to Lose, which reviewed the group's accomplishments up to that point and renewed the call for speedy action to stem coastal land loss. Now, if you read both of these reports side by side, one of the things that you notice is that, well, here today, gone tomorrow, the first one, advocated for regulatory restrictions on oil and gas drilling and on the navigation industry. Those proposals were not included in No Time to Lose. And this had a lot to do with CRCL's effort during that period, during the intervening period, to build alliances with members of the local business community who in southern Louisiana tend to be very strongly anti-regulation. I want to be clear here. This was not a matter of CRCL selling out. That's not what I'm trying to say. This was a pragmatic strategy that the group pursued to raise awareness about coastal land loss as an urgent issue. CRCL's director during the 1990s, a fellow named Mark Davis, explained to me in an interview that CRCL faced the challenge of being a civic organization in an area that is weak on civics. He continued, the Deep South, and certainly Louisiana, have very weak civic institutions. Change is not viewed as progress. It's viewed as something to be worried about, oftentimes. And in this context, CRCL needed to find points of agreement with people who had economic and political influence. And in Louisiana, these people tended to be local business leaders. They were successful at this, largely because of CRCL's work. For example, Louisiana Governor Mike Foster convened an executive-level coastal advisory board in 2001, which was headed by King Milling. His first name really is King, who is the president of Whitney Bank, which is an important regional financial institution in southern Louisiana. And this board, in turn, laid the foundation to create the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is a state agency charged with implementing the Coastal Master Plan. But this alliance with business leaders also affected Louisiana's approach to coastal restoration. And specifically, it led advocates to put increasing emphasis on the economic consequences of land loss and to marginalize some of the other ways of thinking about land loss in terms of environmental consequences, social justice consequences, so on and so forth. Many of the people that I interviewed were quite specific about this change. And so, for example, I spoke to King Milling, the first director of that commission, that committee, in Whitney Bank's main office on St. Charles Street, one of the times that I went down to do this research in New Orleans. And he explained to me, he said, my interest primarily relates to commerce. When people from CRCL sat around telling me about the horrible things that were happening to the fish and to the birds, I almost said, get the hell out of here. It's not about that, it's about the towns, it's about communities and the people who are doing the work there. Or consider the recollection of Louisiana's Coastal Affairs Administrator during the early 1990s. She recalled that during this period, you would find very little consensus that restoration was a big issue. At that time, it was all about the environment. You automatically cut off another huge part of the conversation, which was economic. That has changed, and it was not by accident. So the growing awareness of coastal restoration and growing political energy behind coastal restoration in Louisiana has really been linked to this reframing of restoration as an issue of economic development. And that, in turn, is a framing advanced by members of the business community in southern Louisiana. This framing appears in the master plan itself as well. These are 2 pages from the 2017 master plan. The first here sort of presents a case. Why should we fund restoration? And this case is all sort of in terms of the economic contributions that southern Louisiana makes to the state's economy and to the national economy in terms of shipping, energy production, and seafood mainly. And this other one here is a photograph from the master plan that looks sort of very, very environmentally oriented, very natural. But the text reads, protecting and restoring Louisiana's coast makes sense on its own merits, but action at the scale recommended in the master plan will do more than defend our way of life. By rebuilding wetlands and protecting communities from flooding, we can create new jobs, spur sectors of innovation, and strengthen our state's economy. this economic framing is really quite overt in coastal restoration. Now, this way of understanding coastal restoration has also encouraged support for large-scale restoration projects, which are viewed as an engine of economic growth in the region, in the sense that they provide jobs for engineering and for construction firms. The most significant of these projects are river diversions, which are planned to be constructed along the Mississippi River. And these river diversions, their intent is to reintroduce sediments that are carried by the river into wetlands areas. So if you remember that picture that I showed earlier of sediment-starved wetlands, it's an effort to change that situation. This is a photo of one existing diversion to give you a sense of what's being talked about here. This is a diversion at Carnarvon near New Orleans. It's essentially a cut in the levee along the river's bank. So this is the Mississippi River. A cut in the levee, and water from the river flows through this cut into sort of an artificial channel here. It flows for about a mile before settling into an area called Big Mar, a basin called Big Mar. And this is the same thing sort of from an aerial viewpoint. So the diversion is there, the water flows here, and then it settles here into Big Mar. The diversions predicted or presented in the master plan are sort of, they follow the same principles, but they're much larger than Carnarvon. So they would look something like this, as opposed to the smaller one that I just showed you. Carnarvon is capable of diverting about 8,000 cubic feet per second of river water into Big Mar. And the largest diversion that's projected to be built in the master plan would run it up to 75,000 cubic feet per second, so really orders of magnitude larger. And on the other hand, less attention has been given to small and economically marginal communities along the coast, which may need to relocate or engage in what's called non-structural protection, such as the elevation of buildings. The need for non-structural protection is recognized in the master plan, but it hasn't been funded yet. You may have heard of the resettlement, proposed resettlement of Ile de Jean Charles in southern Louisiana. Most of the residents of this community are Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw tribe members. And this resettlement is occurring mainly because of a HUD grant, a Housing and Urban Development Grant. It's not something that's supported by the state of Louisiana. This is an example of what's not being funded by Louisiana. The New York Times referred to it as resettling the first American climate refugees, which is not actually accurate. The first resettlements have occurred in Alaska, not in Louisiana. So at this point, I'd like to switch tracks and consider the development of scientific institutions that support coastal restoration planning. Well, coastal geologists and ecologists have been at the forefront of identifying land loss as a serious problem facing the state. As I mentioned earlier, many of the founding members of CRCO were scientists. Scientists also developed restoration proposals that appear in the current master plan. So, for example, the idea of river diversions was introduced in a systematic way by a leading geologist of river deltas named Sherwood Gagliano and one of his colleagues, Johannes van Beek. In 1975, they published a report called An Approach to Multi-Use Management in the Mississippi River Delta System. And they argued for the value of what they called controlled floods, which today we would call diversions. And they even presented a map that proposed several sites for diversions. And some of these actually are sites that are proposed for diversions in the current master plan. Now, scientific work continues to play a central role in coastal restoration planning. The 2012 version of the master plan, in particular, employed a sophisticated set of predictive models to analyze how proposed projects would affect river flows and ecological services and things like that. But I'd like to take a step back from the products of scientific research to look more closely at the organization of scientific activity related to coastal restoration. And the dimension that I want to highlight is the concentration of this research into a nonprofit institution called the Water Institute for the Gulf, or TWIG is the acronym. Twig was created in 2011 with funding from the state of Louisiana, with the main goal of making applied research more efficient. So state administrators argued that decentralized research taking place in many universities across the coast just didn't move quickly enough to respond to emerging needs. This was actually right after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. As Twig's chief scientist put it to me, she explained, quote, "The state folks found it very difficult because they didn't have any easy mechanisms to assemble scientific advice. It was very difficult to have an organizing mechanism when people were scattered across different research institutions at universities, and there wasn't an obvious central place to go without alienating somebody else." Much of the work that goes into Twig, that goes on in Twig, is focused specifically on evaluating projects for candidacy in the master plan. And it is more efficient than it was before. But the flip side of this is that some university-based scientists have found themselves pushed to the sidelines in the planning process. As a former director of coastal affairs in Louisiana explained to me, she said, people at universities in Louisiana were supposed to be complete and equal partners with the Water Institute, instead of the Water Institute competing for money with the universities and engineering firms. But the universities and so many other institutes are really being shut out of the process. Now, the concern that critics raise is that the concentration of applied research in Twig makes it difficult to focus the attention of planners on broader questions that have significant implications for restoration projects. So take sediment diversions, for instance. Which would be more effective? A few large diversions or many small ones? Where should diversions be built? How much sediment is actually in the Mississippi River? How would agricultural fertilizers, also carried by the river, affect coastal wetlands? How would geological faulting affect the operation of diversions over their lifespans? These are unanswered questions that have significant implications for the effectiveness of diversions as a restoration strategy. And the concern is that research on many of these issues is becoming isolated from the planning process in the effort to move quickly in coastal restoration work. Additionally, some university-based scientists have raised the concern that the concentration of scientific research in Twig will contribute to the flattening of the intellectual landscape that I mentioned earlier. And this is particularly the case for social scientists. For example, I spoke to one sociologist whose work focuses on resilience in coastal communities. And she described scientific work on coastal restoration as sort of a hierarchy, with the physical scientists at the top, followed by chemists, biologists, and ecologists, and then the social scientists near the bottom. And the point here is that those who might have the most professional preparation to engage in an analysis of power and inequality are really the furthest from decision-making processes in the current organization of the coastal restoration scientific community. Now, this isn't to say that decisions about the master plan are sort of made in a smoke-filled back room. In fact, state planners and scientists at Twig work very hard to make the process transparent. So in my research so far, only a very few people that I've contacted have refused to sit down with me, and every person who's highly involved in the master plan has talked to me at length about the work that they do. And I think this shows a real commitment to transparency. But at the same time, many efforts towards public outreach have been contentious and unpleasant for people involved, both planners and members of the community. For example, one journalist described a 2013 meeting in St. Bernard Parish, which is southeast of New Orleans, in this way. St. Bernard and Plaquemine Parish fishers scolded state officials and local scientists in a heated meeting, often with hundreds in the audience clapping and raising their red, fully united, stop diversions placards after the more provocative comments. There was a great deal of yelling by fishers, screaming about what they alleged was misinformation by state officials. Tell us the truth, they decried. Many gave impassioned speeches about how they fear their livelihoods and culture will be lost due to the sediment and freshwater diversions proposed by the master plan. So kind of dramatic journalistic writing here, but capturing that it was not a very pleasant meeting to be involved in. Now, there's also been criticism by some in Louisiana's environmental community who otherwise don't have very much in common with the fishers. For example, a demonstration took place at the New Orleans Superdome last April, which was hosting a Bureau of Ocean Energy Management lease sale for oil and gas sites in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, how is this connected with the master plan? Well, the main federal funding mechanism for coastal restoration work, the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, diverts revenue from Gulf lease sales to support projects in the master plan. So through this mechanism, coastal restoration is linked to ongoing oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the protest organizers explained to me that this means that we have to extract more to get more, and it's like a self-defeating prophecy. You have the 8th largest source of carbon that's up for auction, and if that carbon gets released into the atmosphere, then it's going to harm the climate and cause sea levels to rise and cause hurricanes to become more powerful. And the irony that he's pointing to is really striking, that financing for Louisiana's coastal master plan depends on perpetuating activities that put the coast at risk and have caused some of the land loss problems that the state is facing now. But the vigor of these protests, in many ways, is driven by people's feelings that restoration planning has gone on without their presence, and that the planning process has shut out important concerns and ideas. So that is, the plan has become narrowly technical and linked to the interests of privileged groups, without concern for the welfare of other residents or the larger environmental forces at stake. This is the concern, this is the critique of the master plan. Now, I'm making these points sort of in the spirit of constructive critique. I do think that Louisiana is at the forefront of regional climate change adaptation, but I also think that Louisiana's efforts with its master plan raise important questions about how climate adaptation can be made more democratic. And this is the last point that I want to discuss. So I'm using the term climate adaptation to refer to activities that increase the resilience of human communities and natural ecosystems in the face of climate-induced disruptions. And this contrasts with climate mitigation, which refers to efforts to alter human activities that contribute to climate change. So how can adaptation be made more democratic? And why should it be? Well, in her 2014 book, This Changes Everything, the progressive activist Naomi Klein argued that climate change represents a historic opportunity to advance policies that dramatically improve lives and reinvigorate democracy from the ground up. It can disperse power into the hands of the many rather than consolidating it into the hands of the few, and radically expand the commons rather than auctioning it off in pieces. The Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh made a similar point during a recent series of lectures at the University of Chicago. Bleak though the terrain of climate change may be, he explained, there are a few features in it that stand out in relief as signs of hope. If climate change represents, in its very nature, an unresolvable problem for modern nations, I would like to believe that a great upsurge of protest movements around the world could break through the deadlock and bring about fundamental changes. Now, neither Klein nor Ghosh argue that democratic responses to climate change will be easy, but they do insist that only democratic responses can lead to strategies that are both effective and equitable. And effectiveness and equity are really important stakes in Louisiana's master plan. One thing I think that we can take from Louisiana's experience is that effectiveness and equity may be in tension with efficiency and pragmatism when it comes to climate change adaptation. So it was efficient for the state to concentrate science and engineering in a single organization, but doing so may have limited the perspectives involved in the planning process. And this, in turn, has implications for the effectiveness of adaptation projects. It was pragmatic for CRCL to build alliances with regional business leaders, but this has pushed other coastal residents to the margins. Alliance building that takes place without an analysis of power and inequality may well increase the advantage of groups that are already powerful and cause disadvantaged groups to continue to lose out. Nor are transparency and democracy synonymous. While transparency is about public communication, democracy is about the dispersal of power. The larger point to keep in mind is that in Louisiana and elsewhere, adaptation plays out on an unequal social and political landscape. And this landscape creates paths of least resistance, as well as avenues of greater struggle. The urgency associated with climate adaptation makes the paths of least resistance, which are never actually easy to follow, appear attractive or even necessary. But these paths may lead to adaptation strategies that are ineffective and inequitable in the long run. Perhaps one response to this situation would be to resist the temptation to frame adaptation as purely a matter of science and engineering, and instead work deliberately to bring multiple experiences and forms of understanding into the adaptation process. And in fact, that is going on to a limited extent in southern Louisiana, and I could speak about that. But I do think such a strategy is difficult to pursue without squarely confronting inequalities of power and forms of social exclusion that exist in Louisiana and elsewhere. And for this reason, I think that bringing a critical social science perspective to bear on adaptation is really essential. As the editors of a recent value about the sociology of climate change put it, these perspectives can show how responses to a changing environment are interwoven into our current social, political, and economic order in order to open up new understandings of the nature of changes necessary for ameliorating and adapting to a changing climate. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, this research is still in progress, but those understandings are what I'm aiming for in the future, what I'm aiming to contribute to. And this is actually why I'm very happy to have presented this research here at the Mitchell Center, given its embrace of interdisciplinary scholarship and its commitment to sustainability solutions. So by way of wrapping up, I would really like to pose a few questions and invite your thoughts about how participation in climate adaptation might be broadening. So what changes in policy might be productive? What efforts might be effective at the level of local communities? What strategies might university and advocacy groups develop? I know projects related to this are ongoing in the Mitchell Center currently. And I'm also curious to hear from you about how what's going on in Louisiana compares with climate adaptation here in Maine. I imagine there are both similarities and there are also differences. And of course, I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have about this research as well. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
I know there are tons of questions. Wasn't that wonderful? Lots to think about. So, who wants to start?
Thank you so much, Michael, for a wonderful talk and very provocative. And there are lots of parallels we can draw with what's going on in coastal Maine. I did have one question about your talk. You presented in your first kind of claim that CRCL really had this embrace of the business community and the practicality, and you explore some of the ramifications of that. How much of that is a conversion within the business community and its relationship to restoration activities? It was kind of presented as CRCL chose a pragmatic route. You're not saying they sold out, but there were reasons to do this. And that sort of places them as the arbiters of agency in this capacity. But certainly the business community is also an agentic actor here, a very big one.
Certainly. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the nuances of how that develops? Because I think we see this big rise of resilience investing and more attention to the economic impacts of planning as it relates to climate action.
Thank you for that question. This is great because I'm actually working on a paper on that topic right now. So my answer to that is this. For the business community, or for many members of the business community, environmental restoration is the answer to a problem that has nothing to do with land loss, nothing to do with the environment. The problem is that the industries that have powered Louisiana's growth, most particularly the oil and gas industry, are drying up and leaving the state. So oil and gas drilling was an onshore activity in the 1950s, 1960s, into the 1970s. It moved offshore, so we have things like the Deepwater Horizon rig, which took some money away from Louisiana because offshore sites are property of the federal government. They're not property of the state of Louisiana. And even the offshore industry is moving away. Also refining, that's the other side of the oil and gas industry in Louisiana. There's the upstream side, which is extraction, and the downstream side, which is refining. Refining is also moving out of state, moving to Texas. So the problem that many business leaders see in Louisiana is where's our revenue going to come from? That's the problem that they see. And from their perspective, restoration can be an answer to that question. Louisiana can establish itself, and many people do want it to establish itself, as a leader in water management solutions, sort of as the Netherlands of the continental United States. They view this as a very significant economic opportunity. So restoration, they view it as an answer to a problem, but it's not the answer to the problem that the environmentalists perceive. They perceive a different problem. And I think that's where the convergence has occurred. It really is where the convergence has occurred. But I think that's a great question. Thank you.
Hi. You sort of hinted at the answer with the question I'm going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway, because I've been thinking about what other places might serve as models for the work that's happening in Louisiana, and the Netherlands came to mind as the most obvious example of people who are really great at land restoration.
Mm-hmm.
But are there other communities, geographic locations that Louisiana is looking to, that they're partnering with, that serve as models for the work that they're doing?
Yes, certainly the Netherlands. And actually after Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita in 2005, there were a number of scientific connections that went on between Louisiana and Dutch water scientists. And actually the Water Institute of the Gulf, the scientific organization that I mentioned, was modeled on a group called Deltaris, which is a Dutch group that does a very similar thing, sort of applied science for the Dutch government and also for other clients. I think that's the most significant model that Louisiana is looking to, although there are a lot of differences as well. Both administrative differences between, the way government works in the Netherlands and the way that it works in the US, and also geological differences. So the land in Louisiana is just very different. The deltaic region is very different from what exists in the Netherlands. But yeah, there is that effort to sort of, sociologically, it's sort of a mimetic, sort of what we would call mimetic isomorphism, copying things that are going on in other regions.
Are there, have you noticed tensions around the labeling of this approach as a master plan, as a particular type of articulation of power, especially given the need to be inclusive but also purposeful in the kinds of responses to these issues?
I don't think that there's any, I haven't seen anybody critique the title master plan specifically. And I think that, the idea, part of what they were trying to get at with that title, I think, is the approaching the coast comprehensively as a single unit and trying to coordinate projects and assess projects across the entire coast as opposed to looking piecemeal. But I think there is a fair amount of critique of that this is a top-down effort by the state to make things happen, and people who aren't at the level politically or economically or scientifically where they can have their voices heard in this conversation or feel that they have their voices heard in this conversation. There are critiques that make that point specifically.
Back to the idea of maybe lessons learned from other regions. Domestically here within the United States, are you aware of any discussions going on between the people crafting this kind of policy package and other municipalities? I know my personal experience with this is kind of looking at a similar slice of issues within the context of New York City. And in that policy package, and the resilient New York stuff, you see a lot of the same overt economic and private business, industry-driven lens. So I wonder maybe if there's a certain level of spillage happening from other major cities that are kind of within regions that are looking.
Yeah, the one that the sort of model that I've heard people speak about most is the Everglades restoration in southern Florida. And sort of mainly talking about, well, how administratively was that effort developed, was the funding for that effort, and what ideas can be taken from that and applied to southern Louisiana. There's sort of, a lot of competition going on. People say in southern Louisiana, if you're a farmer in Iowa, you really don't care about the Everglades. Like it doesn't affect your life directly, but southern Louisiana does, because the Mississippi is the main export avenue for grain. In terms of New York, I haven't heard nobody that I've spoken to has mentioned New York specifically. The San Francisco Bay Area has been mentioned, and the San Joaquin River Delta has been mentioned, not in the context of climate change so much, but in the context of wetlands conservation and restoration, which is more advanced in that region than it is in southern Louisiana. But it really is a different set of problems, because the Bay Area and the San Joaquin Delta don't have the same sort of land loss issue that southern Louisiana does, nor the same storms that southern Louisiana does. But I'm not surprised, actually, to hear that, particularly with New York, that there's there are similarities. And there are also other, sort of social and organizational connections between these different regions. So, for example, another big player in southern Louisiana is a coalition of environmental groups. And some of them are local, like CRCL, and then also the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation is another local group. But some are national environmental groups, so the Environmental Defense Fund and the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy are the three big ones. And those groups have projects going on in coastal California, coastal New York, so they're sort of a conduit, I think, of information between these different regions.
Last one.
I was reading a book about half a year ago. They were after President Pennywise won, and they were trying to see why people voted so against their best interests, and they were pretty sure it was Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
And they were interviewing people that they lived in really degrading, crappy areas, and oil companies and gas, they were degrading it, but at the same time they were the only employers. And people were saying, well, yeah, we used to be able to go fishing, we used to be able to swim, but we need to put food on the table, and if they go out, we're going to starve. So how do you make a place ecologically better without sacrificing the people that are at the very bottom?
Yeah, I think that really is that's the key question in efforts like this, because I really do think that Louisiana is really on the cutting edge of regions that are going to be experiencing climate change-induced challenges in coming years. So I see Louisiana as kind of a test case for how all this can work. One of the really interesting things about Louisiana, of course, is that many of the people in Louisiana and many of the political leaders of the state deny that climate change is a thing, or at least that it's a human caused thing, and yet they're willing to put all sorts of political capital into adaptation to climate change, thinking, of course, that this brings economic benefits as well and potentially jobs for people in those communities. Some of the critical scholarship on places like Louisiana has used the metaphor of internal colonies to describe the economic structure of those areas, in the sense that some of the poverty that exists in Louisiana and Mississippi and many southern states is tied to the fact that they're sites of resource extraction for industries elsewhere. And that in order to reduce some of the poverty, you have to get away from that dynamic, where things are taken out of these places and sent somewhere else for somebody else's benefit.
Can we thank Michael again for
Thank you.